Hey everybody, I am doing another topic video where I asked you guys some questions and I'm going to react to it. This week's question was, what is your favorite animated movie? So here we go. Answers here are coming from Twitter and Facebook. SpiderVerse, because it is, in my opinion, the best looking animated film, as well as a strong emotional core to hold it through. So I saw Into the Spider-Verse, is that what it's called? I guess. Yeah. I saw that on a business trip, and I saw it with my coworker who I was rooming with, and she was a big fan of it, wanted to watch it. Now keep in mind, I was on edibles, and I was actually on edibles for the entire trip, and I was in charge too. But it really was kind of perfect for that particular experience because yes, you're right, it is so visually interesting and exciting and just pumped full of vigor. But I remember, again, because I was high as hell, like I just remember thinking, oh my God, I have to write a dissertation on this. Because I found it very interesting looking at the way Spider-Man has been portrayed ever since the Sam Raimi version, which was what, back in like 2001, 2002, something like that. And seeing how he's changed Spider-Man and how he has reflected the zeitgeist, certainly reflected, yes, the culture and politics and technology. And we see such a difference here in this rendition of Spider-Man compared to that one. And all of that I think was really cool. But yes, visually so exciting. And the whole movie just has an energy to it and just a pop. I have so many issues with a lot of the live action comic book movies that we've seen. And this was one of the few where I was like, wow, isn't it refreshing to watch something that actually feels like you're opening an actual comic book? It's just like panels. Everything was so zippy and full of color and just, yeah, funny. It had everything going for it. I will say though, for me, I do remember it kind of struggling in the midsection of it, particularly in, like, if you want to look at the script. The test allies and enemies period for me was a little bit on shaky ground and a little bit muddled, as was the if I remember correctly, the antagonist. But I can't go too much into it because I saw it once and it was over a year ago and I was high. But I really did enjoy it, and I wish that there were more movies like that made, because animation is so wonderful because it's so much closer to abstraction than anything that's live action could be, that's more literal, more concrete. You have so many chances to escape and do different things and bend logic more so when you're doing animation. So I think it's just the perfect vehicle for something like that. The Iron Giant, beautiful animation, perfect voice casting, a memorable score, and has an extremely moving story, along with intelligent screenplay and realistic characters. I think it's a perfect film. Yeah, I think you nailed it. This is one of those movies that I'm just so glad it's developed such a cult following, and really now it feels almost like, yeah, a classic. Cult classic, I'm not quite sure. But I remember seeing it initially when it came out. And surprisingly, I wasn't that into it. I didn't think there was anything about it that was that special. I don't remember what year it came out, but whatever year it did, I remember just being a kid and seeing it with my parents. But seeing it later on, I totally agree with you. It tugs at your heart for sure. It's a really, really well done film, and it is directed by Brad Bird, who I think brings out a lot of that, what makes a children's cartoon palpable. And he's somebody who does seem to have that kind of zippy, fast-paced kind of fun to him, as well as really knowing how to make something resonate when he needs to. I do think it is one of the more underrated films, and I'm so glad it got a resurgence and people look at it the way that they do now. And Dean, I just have to say, I had such a crush on him. He's a great character. Princess Mononoke. The characters are engaging, the conflict is believable, and the animation is gorgeous. So Princess Mononoke is, for me, yeah, it is. It is my favorite Miyazaki film. I think mainly because it's his most mature and his most complex, really his most adult. I think he takes the most risks here, just fundamentally. I reviewed Lawrence of Arabia very, very recently. It was my last review. And I have to say, when I think of Princess Mononoke, and when I think about certain Miyazaki films, yes, they do remind me of like a big David Lean epic. Because, especially when you watch Princess Mononoke, but watching Lawrence of Arabia, the scope of it and the beauty of the compositions and everything is just massive. and amazing, but at the same time, it seems to capture this kind of haunting intimacy. And I think a lot of it is because, you know, they're not afraid to rely on the silences, as I've said so many times. And I feel the same way with Princess Mononoke. It has that grand scope. It is gorgeous, but it really relies on the silence, especially in the beginning, as the escalating tension. The score is just gorgeous. It is my favorite of the Joe Hisaishi and Miyazaki collaborations in terms of music. And it just has that wonder about it, that mysticism, just like Lawrence of Arabia does, really. And what I also love about it is how it is very complex, where there's not really a clear antagonist. There's not really a clear protagonist. It is really a monumental achievement, I think. And a film, if you're a fan of Miyazaki, that's one you really, really, really should check out. It has to be Akira. It really seems relevant now because of its themes of violence, dehumanization, and the power and spirit of youth. That's an excellent point. Yes, it is very relevant now, but I think a lot of dystopian films or dystopian epics really do. A lot of the imagery contributes to how we're feeling right now. So I don't necessarily look at that as something that sets Akira apart necessarily, but I do think Akira is one of the most astounding when it comes to being so individual and unique in terms of its aesthetic. I am such a fan of Akira's aesthetic, just its artfulness. And it's one of the few times where I really think that all of that really elevates the rest of it, because the film is messy and it's very, very ambitious. It's trying to take this really big manga and pigeonhole it into a film that really needed to be maybe twice as long. So there's a lot missing. A lot of it doesn't make sense and doesn't add up. And yet it's still, to me, an absolute masterpiece. A lot of the imagery is very reminiscent of what we see now, but I think the reason why it resonates is because Japanese animation, a lot of the time, they spend time on the detail of things. Every little inch of the frame has personality about it. The world building is absolutely astounding. Their creativity, the imagination, how bold they are. Because here it's futuristic. It's meant to be in the future. And yet it feels old and worn down. And again, very unique, as though people have lived in this world, really, really lived in it. It is a sci-fi cyberpunk film with a real beating heart. It feels like it has veins and blood and flesh and muscles. There's just grit to it and grimace. And honestly, a lot of it is the score as well. And I said this before, I think, when you watch a film like that, you expect there to be like a real synth-based kind of 1980s influence score. And yet here, it's not. It's like this, it's got like African kind of chorals and kind of a tribal feel to it, very percussive. And it gives it that flesh and blood feeling, like it has a heart and a soul to it. And that's part of also, I think, why it really kind of seeps into your being, the feeling of it. I was watching it actually, I think slightly before quarantine began, and someone pointed out to me that, they spray paint Olympics canceled 2020 in the movie because it's supposed to take place, in 2019 or something like that. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, that's pretty coincidental. Oliver and Company captures 80s NYC perfectly. A creative take on Oliver Twist at a time when Disney adaptations tried to be faithful. This film took risks. Also, Billy Joel was brilliant in it. Oh my God. Okay, so I haven't seen Oliver and Company since I was maybe 7 years old, I'm gonna guess. But I do remember a lot about it, or at least I remember a lot about the first act of it. And I know exactly what you're saying. I thought that Billy Joel was really, really great in the role. I guess he's playing a sort of like artful dodger. And I like the way that they were able to animate New York City and all that. It's very fun and exciting. And it does give you that feeling of like a modern Oliver Twist. And that song, that Billy Joel song, is so fucking catchy. I love it. Why should I worry? Tell me. Why should I care? But for me, and I remember thinking this at the time, even though I didn't really know how to communicate it at the time, it does lose its way throughout the movie, and it starts out being really fun and kind of individual, and then it starts to become kind of generic. And I do remember kind of feeling like I lost Oliver's arc throughout it, like the heart and soul of the movie kind of fizzles to make room for a lot of the other things with the allies and the enemies and all of that that are introduced into the movie. It's not a movie that I think is particularly consistent or good. It's far from one of the best Disney animated movies, but it's nostalgic. I'll give you that. Grave of the Fireflies by Takahata. Just a devastatingly human film and a perspective that is not often covered in cinema. Hard to say it's my favorite considering the subject matter, but it is undeniably important in demonstrating the ability of hand-drawn animation as a medium. Absolutely, absolutely. The hand-drawn animation is the key here into why I think this movie is successful. I think it was Roger Ebert who said that this movie couldn't be made for real, even though it's very simple. You know, it does feel like just an animated Italian neo-realist film or something like that. It's very, very simple, very stripped down to the most basic elements, stripped down to such a simple, intimate, raw, and devastating story. And yet because it's so devastating, it's kind of, it wouldn't translate to live action in the same ways, just because, like Roger Ebert said, a lot of, you know, just the starvation and everything, it would, especially when you're dealing with children, it would get in the way of the actual point of it, because it would be so difficult to experience. And yet again, with animation, there's a freedom because it does feel naturally more abstract, where you can tell more stories again and bend the logic in certain ways. And this one, it does have a lot about it that is quite unique, I think, because yes, it is such a dark story. And typically when you have such tragic stories, the look of everything is very grim. But no, this film appreciates the beauty in the small things, like a lot of animated or Japanese animated films do. It has kind of a painterly, almost like Monet watercolor look to it. That's very beautiful because they have to, in the film, kind of appreciate the little things. And they are ultimately still children. And they act like children. So we get to see it sort of through that lens. And also the film is deeply about guilt and being heavily flawed as a human being. And a lot of people who don't like the film does have detractors. A lot of them struggle with the motivation of the main character and that he was so selfish in all of this. And it's like, well, yes, but I don't think that's necessarily a flaw. It's just part of the character and part of the film. I think why they have those surrealistic elements of, you know, his spirit kind of looking back on the story is very important. Experiencing his story again, so he's having to relive all of his actions and all of the consequences of those actions. Relive all of the guilt, because I think guilt is a huge part of this film. I don't think it's necessarily a flaw. I think it's just the reality of things. The reality of humans just being very flawed and making mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can cost you your life. But yes, a gorgeous film, and I think important for everybody to see. I know it's really, really depressing. It's considered one of the most depressing movies ever, but very important. Fantastic Planet for its sheer surrealism, not to even mention that soundtrack. Oh my God, I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm not going to talk about it here because it's something I've kind of been possibly contemplating reviewing, just because it's very psychedelic and, as you say, very surrealistic and trippy and all of those things, and I just really would like to communicate that in some way, if the people are interested. But yeah, really good choice. Disney's Fantasia, because it's such an early and still unique movie. Its history and production are interesting, but it's a real pleasure to watch. I'd love to see a modern-day CGI attempt at something similar. Okay, so I just reviewed this as well, so, you know, go there if you want me to go more in depth on it. But I totally agree with you. I think it would be so cool to see what they could do with it, with this technology, with the CGI and all of that today. Though I would be concerned that they would water it down the same way that they did with Fantasia 2000, which of course was the sequel that came out, what, like 60 years later? And while that film has some beautiful things about it, and it's not a complete failure in it or anything, there are certain things that I think are some of the best animation from Disney. That being said, it does not take the risks of the original. It's not nearly as mature, as sophisticated, as psychedelic, as willing to delve into that kind of soporific, meditative state. And that's what the new one was really lacking. It was very kind of sugar-coated and full of sentiment. But yeah, Fantasia is bold, and it is my favorite of all the the Disney animated films, and I mentioned that in my review, by far, just because it sets itself so apart. It is so artistic and kind of elevated on this plane where the rest of them kind of stick to what is more literal, the typical moral kind of fairy tales and whatnot. This one is all about kind of your brain drifting into this weird kind of imaginative, creative state where things get a little dangerous. And all of that to me is amazing. And it does have some of the coolest, most dark, twisted, badass animation for its time. And it still holds up today. Batman Mask of the Phantasm does cheat a bit, basically being a really long episode of the original animated series, but still works beautifully as an amazing Batman tale. Really glad you brought this one up, because I talked about Batman, I think, a little bit in my last video, whatever that was, Guilty Pleasures. You know, there have been some good adaptations of Batman that have been live action, but none of them have really worked for me in the same way as animation. I said that Tim Burton probably got the closest to achieving kind of the full harmonious blend of all the different Batman facets that we've seen throughout the years, but yet it still just doesn't have the same poetry and the same feeling as animation and that exaggerated quality. And for me, Batman the Animated Series did it the best. Sorry, but of all the different ones, that is by far my best because it completely encompasses everything. Yes, it is kind of film noir. It has kind of an Orson Welles type thing. It's very into kind of the old 1940s Hollywood and radio shows and whatnot, but it's also very funny and slapstick and cartoony. It has that kind of Adam West kind of satirical mentality where it's always kind of winking at the audience, yet there's also a wit to it that reminds me almost of like Bogart and Bacall kind of film noir movies, and yet it also is very, very dark and deals with such mature, emotional stories that are quite interesting, especially for a child. A lot of those episodes still stick with me today because they scared me so much. And Mask of the Phantasm, you're right, it does kind of feel like a prolonged episode of the series. But I think, you know, if they had had a bigger budget, they would have gone further. They would have made it longer because it needed to be. But as it is, I'll go on record as saying that is my favorite Batman film, Mask of the Phantasm. Because, yeah, it is an extension of the animated series, but and probably the most ambitious that they got, while still maintaining that heart of what's important. Bruce Wayne trying to find his identity, and of course the Joker is involved, the mob, and the score is amazing. Really worth your time, I recommend it. And of course Mark Hamill as the Joker, I mean, how do you go wrong with that? The Jungle Book, because Louis Prima and Phil Harris. That's really the only reason that you need. I love Louis Prima, and this movie introduced me to him when I was a little girl, and I became such a huge fan. But yes, that song is the best song in the entire movie for me. I like it better than Bare Necessities or anything like that. But Louis Prima is just a legend of the kind of Dixieland jazz sort of music. And yes, Phil Harris is fantastic. This movie, to me, I like because it's back when Disney didn't take itself so seriously. It was before, you know, Beauty and the Beast got a Best Picture nomination, and after that, every Disney movie had to be some sort of like serious and deep sort of ploy to get Oscar nominations. So you had, you know, like, we're gonna go and do like Lion King, where it has to have this like dramatic Hamlet sort of thing, and then we're gonna do Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is really, really dark, and Pocahontas, these grand epic stories, and none of them were quite working out the way that Beauty and the Beast did. The Lion King, I think, got close. But yeah, this was just a time when you could just be a kid, have fun, and not take things so seriously. This is the stoner version of The Lion King. You just have kind of these episodic moments. Yes, there is a hero's journey, but you know, you're meeting all of these interesting characters and just kind of sitting with them for a while and chilling out. I think that this movie is pure fun, and I miss when kind of the Dixieland jazz music was a vehicle for all of the Disney stories back in the day. And this was mostly in the 60s that we saw that. But yeah, there's just so much to enjoy in The Jungle Book. Is it some grand, ambitious thing? No. But kind of what I wish more animated films were like today. Not taking childhood so seriously. So yes, those are some of your responses and my reactions to them. Thank you guys for answering the question. If you have any other suggestions on other questions for me to ask, let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.